Good evening, and welcome, dear friends of mystery. Tonight, we travel to a corner of the English countryside where the fog does not lift easily, and where an old stone house called Briar Estate has stood, quiet and watchful, for nearly 100 years. To its neighbors, it is simply old. To its family, it is something else entirely, a house that remembers. Into this house comes a small man with an egg-shaped head, a magnificent moustache, and a mind that misses nothing. Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He has come for a quiet weekend. He will not get one. For at Briar, the sins of the past do not stay buried. They wait. And when the estate's secret finally rises to the surface, it will not come alone. It will bring death with it. Now then, let us begin. The invitation. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Hercule Poirot always considered an unlucky day for the arrival of letters. Tuesdays brought bills, or invitations to dull dinners, or, worse, requests from acquaintances who wished him to find a lost dog. This letter, however, was written in a hand he recognized at once. Small, precise, faintly old-fashioned. It was from Henry Lassiter, a solicitor of some standing, whom Poirot had known for perhaps 20 years, ever since a small matter involving a forged will had first brought them together. "My dear Poirot," the letter began, "I find myself in need of your company, though I confess I could not tell you precisely why. There is a family matter, concerning a client of mine, a Mrs. Constance Ashworth of Briar Estate, Norfolk. Nothing has happened, and yet I have the persistent and foolish feeling that something is about to. Come and stay the weekend, as my guest. If nothing occurs, you will have had a pleasant few days in the country, and I shall have made a fool of myself, which I am quite prepared to accept." Poirot had read the letter twice, set down his coffee, and instructed George to pack for 3 days. It was not, he told himself on the train, that he believed in Lassiter's feelings. Lassiter was a sensible man, not given to fancy. But a solicitor who wrote of foolish feelings was a solicitor who had noticed something his professional mind could not yet name. And it was precisely such things, the things that could not yet be named, that interested Hercule Poirot most. The train deposited him at a small station called Hesselworth, where a car was waiting, driven by a taciturn young man who informed Poirot, without being asked, that it would rain before evening. Poirot looked at the sky, which was a hard, pale grey, and privately agreed, though he said nothing, being at that time somewhat occupied with a slight discomfort in his lower back, the result of an unwise decision to sleep in a train compartment 2 nights previous during a case in Yorkshire that had, in the end, amounted to very little. He was, he reflected, growing old. Not old in the sense of being unable to think. His mind, thank God, remained as orderly as ever, but old in the sense that his body now sent him small bills for services rendered, which it had not troubled to do 20 years before. Briar Estate announced itself first as a smudge of dark trees on the horizon, and then, as the car turned up a long gravel drive, as a house of considerable age and considerable gloom. It was built of grey stone gone nearly black with weather, 3 stories, with narrow windows that seemed to Poirot less like eyes than like slits in armour. Built, perhaps, by some ancestor who had trusted his neighbours rather less than was polite to admit. Ivy had been allowed to climb unchecked along one wing, and a line of ancient yew trees, clipped into shapes long since forgotten, stood like a row of hunched old servants along the eastern lawn. "Alors," thought Poirot, stepping from the car and settling his hat with some care, for the wind here had teeth in it. "This is a house that does not forgive." He was not a man given to fancies about houses. A house was brick and mortar, and any atmosphere it possessed was supplied entirely by the imagination of the person looking at it. And yet he found himself, for just a moment, standing quite still on the gravel, looking up at those narrow windows, before he caught himself and gave a small, private, disapproving shake of the head. The shake of a man scolding himself for behaving like a character in one of those novels his friend Ariadne Oliver wrote, in which houses were always sinister and butlers always guilty. Henry Lassiter met him at the door himself, which Poirot thought interesting. A solicitor of Lassiter's standing staying as a guest in a house such as this, would ordinarily have allowed the butler to perform such courtesies. Poirot, thank God. Lassiter shook his hand with more warmth than the greeting required. He had aged since Poirot had last seen him, the hair greyer, the face thinner, but it was not age alone that Poirot read in his old friend's face. It was tiredness, not the tiredness of the body, but of a mind that has been turning over the same problem for too many nights without resolution. You look, said Poirot, with the bluntness he permitted himself only with old friends, as though you have not slept. I haven't. Not properly. Come in, come in. You'll want tea, and I shall want to talk to you before dinner, if I can manage it, without half the house listening. The hall into which Poirot stepped was dim, panelled in dark oak that had absorbed a century of smoke from the great fireplace and given nothing back. Portraits lined the walls, Ashworths of one generation or another, Poirot supposed, though their faces had darkened with varnish until they seemed less like individuals than like a single disapproving ancestor repeated many times over. A grandfather clock, taller than Poirot himself, ticked with a slow, deliberate heaviness, as though it too found the passage of time in this house to be something of a burden. The family, said Lassiter, lowering his voice as they crossed the hall, is not large. Mrs. Ashworth, Constance, is the widow. Her husband, Edgar Ashworth, died some 11 years ago. Heart, they said, though he was not yet 60. There are 2 children, well, hardly children now. Rupert, the son, 34, who manages the estate, or believes he does. And Marianne, the daughter, 29, unmarried, who paints rather badly and reads rather too much. There is also a nephew, Victor Ashworth, son of Edgar's late brother, who arrived to stay some 3 weeks ago and has, as far as I can tell, no particular intention of leaving. And there is Miss Pruitt, Constance's companion, been with the family for years, utterly devoted, and I think the only person in the house who is entirely what she appears to be. You suspect the others of concealment. I don't know what I suspect. Lassiter stopped at the foot of the staircase and looked at Poirot directly. Edgar Ashworth's death 11 years ago was never, quite, satisfactorily explained to my private satisfaction, though publicly it was all correct enough. Doctor's certificate and all. I did not question it at the time. Why should I have? But 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Ashworth wrote to me asking that I revise her will, urgently, and would say nothing of why. And a week after that, someone broke into the estate office. Nothing was taken, or nothing that I have been able to identify, but Edgar's old papers had been gone through. And 2 nights ago, Marianne Ashworth told her mother, in my hearing, that she had seen a light moving in the old chapel ruin at the bottom of the garden, at an hour when no living soul in this house had any business being there. Poirot's eyebrows had risen slightly during this recitation. The old chapel is used for nothing. Nothing. It has been a ruin since before the war. The roof came down in a storm, 30 years ago now. No one goes there, which is rather the point. I see. Poirot was silent a moment, turning his moustache thoughtfully between finger and thumb, a habit George had once, tactfully, suggested he abandon, as it was inclined to disarrange the wax. And you believe these 3 things, the will, the papers, the light in the chapel, are connected? I believe, said Lassiter slowly, that something which was buried 11 years ago is being dug up. I do not know by whom, or why now, or what it is, precisely, that will be found. I only know that I do not like the feeling in this house, and I have never been a fanciful man, Poirot, as you well know. It was at this moment, and Poirot would remember it afterward, with some professional annoyance at himself for not having paid it closer attention at the time, that a woman appeared at the top of the staircase. She was perhaps 60, dressed with the particular severe elegance of a woman who had once been very beautiful and had not entirely forgiven time for taking it from her. She descended with a straight back and a composed face, and yet Poirot, watching her hand upon the banister, saw that it gripped the rail rather more tightly than the shallow stairs required. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was low, well-schooled. Henry has told you nothing alarming, I hope. He has become quite the old woman these past weeks. There was an attempt at lightness in this that did not entirely succeed. He has told me only that you have been kind enough to permit an uninvited guest to disturb your household, madame, said Poirot, bowing over her hand with the old-world courtesy he still, at moments like this, found useful, for which I thank you. You are not uninvited. You are very welcome. Constance Ashworth's eyes, pale grey and very steady, met his for a moment longer than the pleasantry required. Though I confess, I do not entirely know why Henry felt it necessary to summon a— Forgive me, monsieur, I intend no disrespect— a detective, for what is, I am quite sure, nothing at all. Nothing at all is very often, said Poirot gently. The thing I am most interested to examine, madame. It has a way of turning out to be something, he thought, though he could not afterward have sworn to it with the certainty he liked to bring to such observations. That something moved behind her composed grey eyes at these words. Not fear, precisely. Something closer to recognition, as though she had, for 11 years, been waiting for someone to say exactly that to her, and had rather hoped they never would. Outside, as the taciturn young driver had predicted, it began, very softly, to rain. What the house does not say. Dinner at Blackbriar was served at 8, in a dining room whose ceiling had darkened with 2 centuries of candle smoke, and Poirot found himself seated between his hostess and a young man who could only be Rupert Ashworth, tall, fair, with the slightly too careful manners of a man who has spent his life being told he is not quite equal to his responsibilities, and has decided, as a result, to be scrupulously correct about everything else instead. "You'll forgive us if the conversation is dull, Monsieur Poirot," Rupert said, passing the wine with exaggerated attention to the label. "We're not a very interesting family. Farms, drainage, the price of barley. Mother will tell you I've turned into quite the bore since father died." "I have said no such thing," said Constance Ashworth mildly, though Poirot noticed she did not quite meet her son's eye when she said it. Across the table, a young woman with her mother's pale eyes and a good deal less of her composure was cutting her food into small, untouched pieces. This was Marianne, 29, unmarried, and, Poirot thought, watching her, a young woman carrying something heavy enough that it showed in the set of her shoulders. Beside her sat a dark, watchful man of perhaps 30 who had been introduced simply as Victor, the nephew, and who ate with the neat, economical movements of a man accustomed to eating alone. "You've come a long way for a family with nothing interesting about it, monsieur," Victor said suddenly, breaking a silence that had gone on a beat too long. His voice was pleasant enough, but his eyes, Poirot noted, were not smiling at all. "Henry must have painted us in very dramatic colours." "Monsieur Lassiter has painted you in no colours whatsoever," said Poirot equably. "I know only that I am a guest, and that the beef, madame, is excellent." There was a small ripple of relieved laughter at this, the laughter of people glad to be given permission to speak of something else, and the talk turned, safely, to barley. But Poirot, who had spent a professional lifetime cataloguing what people did not say, had already gathered a small harvest of his own. He had noticed that Rupert's hand, when he lifted his glass, was not perfectly steady. He had noticed that Marianne's eyes went, twice, to the darkened window behind her mother's chair, as though she expected to see something there. He had noticed that Victor Ashworth, though he spoke easily of the estate, spoke of it as a man speaks of a house he is considering, not one he merely visits. And he had noticed, above all, the empty chair at the foot of the table, laid with its own place, its own untouched wineglass, which no one had troubled to explain, and which no one, all evening, had so much as glanced toward. It was Miss Pruitt, the companion, small and grey and unremarkable as a wren, who told him of it later, when the family had dispersed after dinner, and Poirot, professing a wish for air, had found her instead in the garden, cutting the last of the autumn roses by lamplight, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not care to sit idle with her thoughts. "That was Mr. Edgar's chair," she said, without being asked, snipping a stem with more force than the task required. "Mrs. Ashworth has had it laid every night since he died. 11 years, monsieur. I have never asked her why, and she has never told me, and I dare say that is the correct arrangement between an employer and a companion who values her position. But you have wondered. I have wondered a great many things in this house, Monsieur Poirot, and I have learned that wondering does no good at all. She straightened, and for a moment the brisk composure slipped, and he saw a woman genuinely, quietly frightened. There is something wrong here. There has been something wrong since before Mr. Edgar died, if you want my honest opinion, which nobody has asked for in 11 years. He was not a happy man in his last months. He used to walk down to the old chapel at all hours, the ruin, at the bottom of the garden, and come back looking as though he had seen his own grave. And 3 weeks ago, Miss Marianne began doing exactly the same thing. You believe there is a connection? I believe, said Miss Pruitt, gathering her roses with hands that trembled very slightly, that whatever Mr. Edgar found in that chapel, or buried in that chapel, or could not stop thinking about in that chapel, has not stayed buried. And I think Mrs. Ashworth knows it, and Mr. Rupert suspects it, and Miss Marianne has very nearly found it out for herself. And I think, monsieur, that is a dangerous thing for a young woman to go looking for alone, at night, in a house like this one. Poirot walked with her back toward the lighted windows of the house, turning this over with the particular pleasure he took in a fact that did not yet fit anywhere. This nephew Victor, he said. He arrived 3 weeks ago, you said. The same week the light was first seen in the chapel. Miss Pruitt stopped quite still on the gravel path. I had not thought of that, she said slowly. But now that you say it, yes, the very same week. Later that night, unable to sleep, a common enough affliction, in a strange bed, though Poirot suspected the true cause lay less in the mattress than in the small, insistent tapping of his mind against a problem it had not yet been given permission to properly examine. He drew back the curtain of his room and looked down over the dark garden. The moon had come out from behind the clouds, thin and cold, and by its light he could just make out, at the far end of the lawn, the broken shape of the old chapel, roofless, its walls standing black against the paler dark of the sky, like the ribs of some long-dead animal. And there, quite unmistakably, moving slowly along the base of one ruined wall, was a small point of yellow light. Poirot stood at the window for a long moment, watching it, his moustache quite motionless, his small eyes very sharp and very still. He did not go down. An old man in carpet slippers, stumbling about a ruin in the dark, would learn nothing that a patient man could not learn better in the morning, by daylight, with his wits fully about him. But he noted the time, 20 minutes past 1, and he noted too a small and troubling fact that he did not care for at all, that Marianne Ashworth's bedroom, which lay along the same corridor as his own, had been dark and silent when he passed it not 10 minutes before. Whoever was walking in the chapel tonight, it was not, this time, the frightened daughter of the house. Alors, thought Hercule Poirot, letting the curtain fall, the house begins, at last, to speak. One has only to be patient enough to listen, and careful enough not to be the next thing it says. The thing buried twice. Poirot rose early, a habit that had served him well in some 40 years of professional life, since it is a curious fact that houses which guard their secrets carefully by day are frequently careless about them before the household has properly woken. By 6:30 he was dressed, his moustache attended to with its usual meticulous care despite the earliness of the hour, and making his way down the wet lawn toward the ruined chapel. His good shoes, he noted this with some private regret, sinking rather further into the soft ground than he would have liked. The chapel, seen by grey morning light, was smaller than it had appeared from his window. 4 broken walls of flint and mortar enclosing a floor of cracked flagstones, over which moss and bramble had crept with the patient thoroughness of 30 untended years. The roof beams, where they had fallen, lay half buried in earth and nettle. It was, Poirot thought, exactly the sort of place a family stops mentioning and then, eventually, stops remembering, which was, he suspected, rather the point of its existence. It did not take him long to find what he had come for. Near the eastern wall, where the old altar stone still lay canted at its ancient angle, the ground had been disturbed, not once, but twice, and at different times. The older disturbance had settled and grassed over, years old, a shallow depression, perhaps 4 feet long. The newer one was fresh, the earth still dark and loose, and beside it, half trodden into the mud, lay a woman's garden trowel of the ordinary domestic sort, and a scrap of oiled paper such as one might use to wrap something one wished to keep dry. Poirot crouched, with the small grunt of a man whose knees had opinions about crouching, and examined the trowel without touching it. Then he turned his attention to the altar stone itself, and after a moment's study, applied his gloved fingers to its edge and found that it moved. Not easily, for it was heavy, but it moved, on some old and long-forgotten hinge of its own weight, to reveal beneath it a cavity perhaps a foot square, empty now but for a scattering of soil, and, caught in one corner, a single fragment of blue ribbon, faded almost to grey. "So," said Poirot softly, to no one at all, "something was hidden here, something was found here, recently, and by more than one person, at more than one time, and now it has been taken away." He was still crouched over the cavity, turning the fragment of ribbon between 2 fingers, when a voice behind him made him rise rather more quickly than his knees appreciated. "You've found it, then?" Marianne Ashworth stood at the broken chapel door, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the season, her face white and her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told Poirot she had slept very little, if at all. She did not seem surprised to see him there. She seemed, if anything, relieved. "I have found a hiding place, mademoiselle, which has recently been emptied. I have not yet found what it hid, nor who emptied it. Perhaps you will be so kind as to assist me." She came further into the ruin and sat down, quite suddenly, on the fallen edge of a roof beam, as though her legs had simply stopped consenting to hold her. "It was letters," she said. "My father's letters. I found them 3 weeks ago. I'd come down here after Miss Pruitt told me once, years ago, that father used to walk here, and I don't know what I was looking for. I think I simply wanted to feel close to him, and I found that the altar stone moved, and underneath it there was a tin box, and inside the box there were letters, in his handwriting, to a woman who was not my mother." "Ah," said Poirot gently, "that wouldn't have... I mean, it's not a pleasant thing to learn about one's father. But it isn't unusual, is it, Monsieur Poirot? Men have secrets. I could have forgiven that." Her hands in her lap twisted together. "But one of the letters wasn't to her at all. It was to my Uncle Victor's father, my father's brother, who died years before I was born, in a shooting accident on this estate, when they were both young men. And in the letter father wrote—" She stopped, and made herself continue in the flat, careful voice of someone repeating words she had memorized against her will. "He wrote that he could not go on carrying alone the weight of what happened in the chapel that October, and that he feared the boy will ask questions one day, and I will not know what to tell him." Poirot was very still. The boy. This would be Victor, my cousin. His father died when Victor was a baby. He was raised by an aunt, and only came to know us properly these last few years. I think, her voice dropped almost to nothing, I think my father may have had something to do with his brother's death, monsieur, 30 years ago, in this chapel, and I think Victor has been looking for proof of it ever since he arrived. You have shown him the letters? No. No. I hid them again. I put them back exactly as I found them. I didn't know what to do, and then 2 nights ago I came down and the box was gone, and the stone had been moved, and I didn't know if it was Victor or Rupert, or... She stopped herself, but Poirot, watching her closely, saw quite clearly the name she had not permitted herself to say. "Or your mother," he finished, quietly. Marianne said nothing at all, which was, in Poirot's long experience, very frequently the most eloquent answer a person could give. He walked her back to the house himself, saying little, turning the small fragment of blue ribbon over in his pocket like a rosary bead, and it was as they crossed the lawn that they came upon Rupert Ashworth, dressed for riding, crossing from the stables with a face so grim that Marianne stopped in her tracks. "Rupert, what's happened?" "Nothing's happened," said Rupert, too quickly, and then, seeing Poirot, seemed to reconsider. "That is, nothing yet. I had a rather unpleasant conversation with Victor before breakfast. He as good as told me he intends to contest the estate. Some nonsense about our grandfather's original settlement and Uncle's rights being improperly passed over when Uncle died. I told him he was mad. He said I'd change my mind when I saw what he'd found. His jaw tightened. I'm going to have this out with him properly. This afternoon, once he's calmer. Once I'm calmer. Monsieur Ashworth, said Poirot, might I suggest that you have this conversation nowhere out of earshot of the household? And in daylight. Rupert looked at him for a long moment, and something in his handsome, careful face flickered. Not quite fear, but its cousin. You think Victor's dangerous? I think, said Poirot carefully, that a family which has kept the same secret buried for 30 years does not always know, when it is finally dug up, which of its members will be most frightened by the digging, nor what a frightened person may do. It was advice that Rupert Ashworth did not, in the event, take. He was not seen at luncheon, which no one remarked upon, as he frequently rode out over the estate at midday and returned late. He was not seen at tea, which Constance Ashworth remarked upon with the first real unease Poirot had yet seen crack her composure. And when, at 6:30, with the light already failing and a thin cold rain beginning to fall, one of the estate hands came running up from the direction of the lower paddock, white-faced and breathless, asking in a voice that would not quite steady itself whether anyone had seen Mr. Rupert since the morning, Hercule Poirot set down his coffee cup, rose from his chair without haste, and said in the quiet, final tone of a man to whom the answer has just become entirely clear, I think, madame, we had better go down to the chapel. They found him there, at the foot of the eastern wall, beside the altar stone that had, that morning, concealed 30 years of silence, lying very still, with the rain beginning to darken his riding coat, and a wound at the back of his skull that no fall from that low, crumbling wall could ever, in Poirot's considerable professional experience, have produced by accident. The weight of what was not said. The local police arrived within the hour. A detective inspector named Hollis, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the manner of a man who had spent 20 years learning that country tragedies were usually either very simple or very complicated, and rarely anything sensible in between. He had heard of Hercule Poirot, as it turned out, and was inclined, after the first quarter hour, to be grateful rather than territorial. A rarer quality in policemen than Poirot always found it polite to pretend. Blow to the back of the head, Hollis said, straightening up from beside the body as the police surgeon finished his preliminary examination in the thin, persistent rain. Something heavy. Something with an edge to it. Doctor thinks 2 hours before we found him. Maybe 3. Puts it somewhere between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. He looked around at the ruined walls, the fallen altar stone, the freshly turned earth beside it, with the particular distaste of a policeman who has just realized his crime scene is also a family's 30-year-old grave. And you're telling me this business, with the letters, and the uncle, and all the rest of it, that's connected. I am telling you, Inspector, that Monsieur Rupert Ashworth came to this chapel intending to confront his cousin about a secret his father buried here 30 years ago, and that he did not leave it alive. Whether these two facts are connected is a question I would be a great fool to answer before I have spoken to everyone in that house who might have followed him down that lawn. It was arranged, with Hollis's somewhat relieved cooperation, that Poirot should conduct his own conversations first, informally, over the course of the evening, before the police proper descended upon Blackbriar in the morning, with their notebooks and their official caution, a caution which, in Poirot's experience, was frequently very good at establishing what had happened, and very poor at persuading anyone to explain why. He began, as he generally did, with the person least likely to have committed the crime, and most likely to have watched everyone who might have, which brought him, an hour later, to the small sitting room where Miss Pruitt sat with her work-basket untouched in her lap, her face the colour of old paper. I was in the linen room from 3 until 4:30, monsieur, mending sheets, and Mrs. Ashworth's maid can confirm it, for she was in and out the whole time fetching pillowcases. Her hands, folded now, were perfectly steady, which struck Poirot as interesting in a woman who had trembled over her rose-cutting 2 nights before. Grief, he reflected, sometimes stilled a person rather than shaking them. I did not see Mr. Rupert at all after breakfast, but I will tell you what I did see, since you will find it out regardless, and I would rather you heard it plainly. At a little after 3, I saw Mrs. Ashworth crossing the lawn toward the chapel. She was wearing her grey coat. She came back perhaps 40 minutes later, and she went straight to her room, and she did not come down again until you sent for her. Constance Ashworth, when Poirot found her in the library an hour after that, did not attempt to deny it. Yes, I went to the chapel. She sat very upright in a wing chair by a fire that had burned low and not been tended, her face composed into the particular stillness of a woman holding herself together by main force of will. Marianne told me this morning what she had found. The letters, the box, all of it. I have known for 30 years what my husband did in that chapel, monsieur. I did not need his letters to tell me. I went down this afternoon to move what remained of the evidence somewhere safer, because I could not bear the thought of Victor finding it and doing whatever it was he intended to do with it. I found the box already gone, the stone already moved. I assumed Marianne had taken it back. I came away. You did not see your son? No. For the first time, something cracked in her voice. Not tears, but something colder and more frightening than tears. If I had seen him, Monsieur Poirot, do you imagine I would have left him there? What, madame, did your husband do in that chapel 30 years ago? She was silent for a long moment, looking into the dying fire, and when she spoke again, it was in the flat, exhausted voice of a woman finally setting down a weight she had carried so long she had almost forgotten its shape. His brother, Victor's father, was not killed by any shooting accident. They quarreled that October over the estate, over money, over a woman neither of them should have wanted. I never learned the whole of it, only what Edgar told me on the night he asked me to marry him, as though he thought I ought to know the truth of the man before I bound myself to him. There was a struggle. His brother fell and struck his head, here, on this very stone. Edgar did not mean to kill him. I have believed that for 30 years, and I believe it still. But he buried the truth here, under that stone, along with certain of his brother's things which I never asked to see, and told the world it was an accident with a gun in the North Wood. And he carried it, and it broke him slowly, for the rest of his life. And I let it, because I loved him, and because by the time I understood the whole of it, Rupert and Marianne were already born. And what good, monsieur, what possible good would it have done any of us to dig it up? And yet, said Poirot gently, it has been dug up, and your son is dead. Constance Ashworth closed her eyes. Yes, she said. God forgive me. Yes. It was past 10 when Poirot finally found Victor Ashworth, alone in the estate office, methodically going through a drawer of old papers by lamplight, with a composure that struck Poirot, on first entering the room, as very nearly suspicious in itself. He revised this opinion within a few minutes. It was not composure at all, but a kind of exhausted numbness, the stillness of a man who had been braced for a blow so long that its actual arrival had left him strangely calm. I didn't kill him, Victor said, before Poirot had asked a single question. I know how it looks. I came here to find proof of what happened to my father. I've spent 3 years chasing rumors and half-finished stories from an aunt who barely remembered him herself. And I found it, finally, 3 weeks ago, in that damned chapel. And yes, I meant to use it. I meant to make Rupert's family pay for 30 years of pretending my father died, falling over his own gun in a wood he'd walked through 1,000 times without incident. I am not ashamed of that. His jaw tightened, but I did not kill him for it. I went riding this afternoon, alone. The west boundary, no one to vouch for me, I'm perfectly aware how that sounds. And I came back at 4:30 to find the whole house already in an uproar. You quarreled with him this morning. We did. He told me I was mad, that I'd get nothing, that our grandfather's settlement was perfectly clear. I told him I'd see him in court if I had to. Victor's hands, Poirot noted, were quite steady on the drawer he had been sorting, steadier, in fact, than seemed entirely natural in a man twice removed. within a day, from both a murder and his own long-sought vindication. I did not think he'd be dead by evening, monsieur. Whatever else you believe of me, believe that. Poirot studied him a long moment, and it was here, though he would not recognize it as such until some hours later, lying awake and turning the day's conversations over with mounting and uncharacteristic dissatisfaction, that he made his error. He believed him. Not entirely, not without reservation, but enough to set Victor Ashworth a little to one side in his mind, as a man with motive but, perhaps, without the particular coldness the act required. And he turned his attention instead, for the rest of that long evening, toward Marianne, and toward the fresh earth beside the altar stone, and toward the small, nagging question of who exactly had removed the tin box a second time, after Marianne had returned it, a question so absorbing that it was not until very late, lying in the dark of his unfamiliar room, with the rain still ticking against the glass, that Hercule Poirot sat up quite suddenly, struck by the sour, private recognition of a man who has just realized he asked every person in a house what they had seen, and never once asked what any of them had been wearing. For Miss Pruitt had said, quite precisely, that Mrs. Ashworth had crossed the lawn that afternoon in her grey coat, and the coat that hung, even now, drying by the kitchen fire, the coat Constance Ashworth had been wearing when they found Rupert's body, was black. The grey coat and the black. He did not sleep again that night, not properly. By 6, he was dressed and down in the kitchen passage, where he found, as he had hoped, the young laundry maid, a girl called Effie, red-eyed with the shock that had settled over the whole house like a fog, laying the fires before the family woke. Mrs. Ashworth's coats, mademoiselle. How many does she possess, and of what colour? Effie blinked at the strangeness of the question, but answered readily enough, in the manner of servants everywhere who have learned that a guest's odd request is rarely worth arguing with. 2 for outdoors, sir. A black one, heavy wool, for church and such, and a grey one, older, that she wears about the garden, though she's not worn the grey much this autumn, on account of Miss Marianne having borrowed it so often. Miss Marianne's own coat went to be relined, you see, a fortnight back, and it's not come back from the tailor's in Sheldon yet. Poirot stood very still for a moment, the small, satisfying click of a fact falling precisely into place, audible to him in the silence of the kitchen passage. Miss Marianne borrowed her mother's grey coat, recently. Perhaps yesterday. I couldn't say for certain, sir, but I saw it hanging on the peg by the garden door yesterday morning, and it wasn't there by tea-time. It was, Poirot reflected, as he thanked her and made his way toward the breakfast room, precisely the sort of fact that a competent detective ought to have secured on the first evening, and precisely the sort of fact that a tired, self-satisfied detective, flattered perhaps by an old friend's urgent letter and the pleasure of being needed, allowed to slip past him while he was busy admiring the shape of a more dramatic mystery. He did not care for the sensation. He resolved, with the particular firmness he reserved for his own failings, to be a great deal more careful with the rest of the day. Marianne did not come down to breakfast. When Poirot inquired, gently, of Miss Pruitt, he was told that Miss Marianne had a headache and wished to be left undisturbed, an excuse so thin and offered with such visible discomfort that it told him a good deal more than a full confession would have done. He found the girl an hour later, not in her room, but in the estate office, standing before the cold grate with a fistful of papers in her hand and a box of matches open on the desk beside her, and he was, on this occasion, quick enough to reach the doorway before she had struck the first one. Mademoiselle Ashworth, I would ask you, most sincerely, not to do that. She turned, and the papers fell from her hand, as though her fingers had simply forgotten how to hold anything. You know, she said, it was not a question. I know that you wore your mother's grey coat yesterday afternoon, and that Miss Pruitt, seeing that coat cross the lawn toward the chapel, believed quite honestly that she had seen your mother. I know that your mother did, in fact, go down to the chapel later that same afternoon, in her black coat, and found nothing, because there was by then nothing left to find. And I believe, mademoiselle, that between those 2 visits, something happened in that chapel which you have been trying, ever since, to carry entirely alone, which is, if I may say so, a very great deal for anyone to carry, and rather more than I think you are able." For a long moment, Marianne said nothing at all. Then, quite suddenly, she sat down in her father's old desk chair, and the composure she had been holding together with such visible effort for 2 days came apart all at once, without drama, the way a rope finally parts after fraying quietly for a long time. "I went back for the box," she said, "after I told you about it, in the chapel that morning. I couldn't stop thinking that I'd left it somewhere Victor might find it again, or the police, and I couldn't bear for it all to come out in some public, ugly way, in a courtroom, with strangers reading father's letters aloud. I only meant to move it somewhere safer. I took mother's coat, because mine was at the tailor's, and it had begun to rain." She twisted her hands together in her lap, the same gesture Poirot had noted in the drawing room 2 nights before, only now without any pretense of stillness beneath it. "Rupert was already there when I arrived. He'd taken the box himself, that morning, after our quarrel with Victor. He told me he meant to burn it, everything, the letters, all of it, and pretend none of it had ever existed, so that Victor would have nothing left to hold over us. And you did not agree. I told him he couldn't, that it wasn't his to burn, that it was the truth, and that Uncle Victor's father deserved to have someone, somewhere, finally admit what had happened to him, even if it ruined us. We argued. I tried to take the box back. He wouldn't let go of it, and he pushed me, not hard. I don't even think he meant it as anything more than getting me out of his way. But the ground there is uneven, and I fell against the altar stone, and I struck my elbow so hard I nearly cried out. And I was so angry, monsieur, angrier than I have ever been in my life. I picked up the old iron bar lying by the gatepost, the broken one from the chapel railing, and I meant only to— I don't know what I meant. I meant to frighten him. I meant to make him stop, and then he was on the ground, and he wasn't moving, and I stood there for I don't know how long before I understood what I had done." She looked up at him then, and her face was that of a much younger and much older person all at once. "I put the bar back where I'd found it. I took the box, and I ran back to the house, and I changed out of mother's coat before anyone saw me, and I have been waiting every hour since for someone to knock on my door and tell me they know. I did not think it would be you, monsieur. I do not know why I thought that would make it easier. It does not." Poirot was silent for a long moment, looking down at the papers scattered across the office floor. 30 years of a family's silence, and now this. And when he spoke, it was with a gentleness that surprised even himself, a gentleness he did not often permit a woman who had, by her own account, just confessed to killing her brother. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you a question, and I ask you to consider it with great care before you answer, because a great deal depends upon it. Not for the law, which will make of this what it will, but for the truth, which is the only thing I have ever truly served. When you struck your brother, did you intend that blow to kill him? Or did you intend, as you have told me, only to make him stop, and did something else, something you did not choose and could not have predicted, happen instead?" Marianne stared at him, and for the first time since he had entered the room, something like hope moved behind her exhausted eyes. I didn't want him dead. I have never in my life wanted anyone dead. I wanted him to stop, and to listen, and to understand that we couldn't simply burn 30 years of the truth because it was inconvenient. That is all I wanted. I swear it to you." "Then I believe you," said Poirot quietly. "Which is not the same thing, mademoiselle, as believing that what you have told me is the whole of what happened in that chapel yesterday afternoon." She went very still. "For you have told me a very complete and very consistent account," he went on, "of a quarrel, a fall, a blow struck in anger and fear. It is, I do not doubt, entirely true as far as it goes. But you have not explained to me one small thing, which has troubled me since I first examined your brother's body in the rain last evening, and which I do not think a young woman defending herself with a length of rusted iron, in a moment of panic, is entirely capable of having done." He paused, and his small eyes, usually so mild, were very steady upon her face. "The wound upon your brother's skull, Mademoiselle Ashworth, was not a single blow. It was 2, struck, the doctor assures me, from slightly different angles, and with, he believes, a small but definite interval of time between them. Someone stood over your brother, mademoiselle, after he had already fallen, and struck him again. The colour, what little remained in Marianne's face, drained from it entirely. That was not me, she whispered. Monsieur Poirot, I swear to you before God, I struck him once. Only once, and then I ran. There was no second blow, not from me. Outside, in the corridor, a floorboard creaked. The particular, unhurried creak of someone who had been standing very still, listening, and had just permitted themselves, at last, to move. What the stone remembers. The drawing-room at Blackbriar had been arranged, at Poirot's request, exactly as it had been on his first evening. The family gathered before the cold hearth, Inspector Hollis stationed unobtrusively by the door, and above the mantelpiece, the dead weight of 30 years of silence, looking down from its heavy gilt frame upon the scene it had, in its way, finally produced. I must begin, said Poirot, standing with his back to the empty grate, by confessing an error, for it is a poor detective who conceals his own mistakes while exposing everyone else's, and I have made, in this house, a mistake I do not care to repeat. On my second evening here, I spoke with Monsieur Victor Ashworth, and I believed him when he told me he had ridden out alone that afternoon along the west boundary, and returned only at 4:30 to find the house already disturbed. I believed him because his calm seemed to me the calm of an innocent man too exhausted for performance. I have since learned, from your head groom, that the horse Monsieur Victor rode that day was returned to its stall, muddied to the knee in a manner consistent with the low ground below the chapel, not the west boundary at all, and that it was returned, by the groom's own careful reckoning, nearer to 4 o'clock than 1/2. Victor Ashworth, seated a little apart from the family that was, in every sense that mattered, no longer entirely his own, did not move. I must tell you also, Poirot went on, that the doctor who examined Monsieur Rupert's injuries found not one wound, but 2, struck from different angles, with, he believes, some minutes between them. The first blow, delivered in fear and fury by someone who wished only to make her brother stop and listen, was not, on its own, a fatal one. It was a blow struck by a frightened young woman with an old iron bar, in panic, in a single terrible instant, and I do not believe, Mademoiselle Marianne, that you have lied to me about a single detail of what you did in that chapel yesterday afternoon. Marianne, white-faced beside her mother, made a small sound that was not quite a sob. But someone came after you had gone, Poirot continued, and now his gaze moved, quietly and without theatre, to rest upon Victor. Someone who found Monsieur Rupert stunned, perhaps, but not yet dead, lying exactly where his father's brother had once lain, 30 years before, upon the same uneven ground, before the same broken altar. Someone who had spent 3 years chasing the truth of his own father's death, and who, in that moment, standing over the son of the man who had buried it, found that the truth, once finally in his hands, was not enough. Someone who wanted, at last, an ending that matched the beginning. You cannot prove that, said Victor. His voice was very quiet, and very steady, and entirely without the outrage of an innocent man wrongly accused. I can prove the mud on the horse. I can prove the hour. I can prove, Monsieur Victor, that the iron bar which struck the second blow was wiped clean of the first blow's traces and returned to a different position than the one in which Mademoiselle Marianne left it, for she has told me, and I believe her, precisely where she dropped it, and it was not found there. Someone moved it, someone wiped it. A frightened girl fleeing in panic does not pause to arrange the scene so carefully. A man who has waited 3 years for justice and has just discovered that justice will not be enough to satisfy him, such a man might. The silence that followed was the longest of the entire evening. It was Victor himself who broke it, and when he did, something in him seemed finally to give way, not into confession exactly, but into something rawer and more honest than the composed grief he had worn since his arrival. I found him on the ground, he said. Not dead, not even close to dead. His eyes were open. He was trying to speak. And I stood over him, in that same chapel, on that same ground where my father died, and no one ever answered for it. No doctor's certificate, no inquiry, nothing but 30 years of silence, and a family that closed ranks and let a woman I never even knew grieve alone for a husband who wasn't even hers to grieve. And I thought, now someone answers. His hands, folded in his lap, were shaking at last, 30 years too late. I didn't plan it. I want you to understand that. I didn't come to that chapel to kill him. But when I saw him lying there, I understood, all at once, that no court, no lawsuit, no inheritance battle was ever going to give me what I actually wanted, which was for someone in this family to bleed the way my father bled, unremarked, unmourned, on that same ground. So I picked up the bar, and I finished it. Constance Ashworth made a sound like something breaking, and Miss Pruitt, without a word, crossed the room and put an arm about her shoulders. A small, quiet gesture that told Poirot more clearly than any confession exactly where 30 years of devoted service had finally, silently, become something closer to love. Inspector Hollis stepped forward then, and the formal words were said, and Victor Ashworth was led from the room with the strange, terrible calm of a man who has been carrying an unbearable weight for so long that its final setting down feels, however dreadful, very like relief. It was Marianne's fate that occupied Poirot rather longer. In the quiet conversation with Hollis that followed once the house had, at last, gone still, he explained, with some care, the doctor's evidence of 2 blows, the difference between a single desperate act and a calculated second one, and watched the inspector's face move slowly from professional caution towards something more humane. There would be a charge, certainly. The law did not forgive a blow merely because it had not, in itself, been fatal, but a charge of manslaughter, Poirot ventured, tried before a jury who would hear the whole miserable history of what that chapel had buried and what it had finally forced into the light, was a very different matter from the charge that might once have been laid. It was not innocence. It was, Poirot thought, walking alone afterward through the darkened hall past the long row of varnished Ashworth faces, as close to justice as this particular house was ever likely to produce. He found Constance Ashworth still sitting before the dead fire, long after everyone else had gone up, and he did not disturb her rest so much as simply sit down across from her, an old man in a cold room, tired in a way that had very little to do with the lateness of the hour. "I kept his chair laid for 11 years, she said, without being asked, because I could not decide whether I was mourning him or watching him. I think, now, it was both. I think I have spent 11 years married to a silence, madame, and I did not even notice when it began to cost more than the truth ever could have." "Most silences do in the end," said Poirot gently. "That is rather the trouble with them. They are cheap to begin, and very dear to maintain, and by the time the bill arrives, madame, it is very rarely the person who incurred the debt who is asked to pay it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not quite comfort, but was, perhaps, its more honest and more useful cousin. The recognition, shared between 2 tired people in a cold room, that some houses cannot be made to forgive, and can only, eventually, be made to stop lying. Poirot left Blackbriar 2 days later, on a morning bright and cold and entirely without fog, as though the house itself, its accounts finally settled, had permitted the weather to be kind. Henry Lassiter drove him to the station himself, and said very little on the journey, which Poirot took, correctly, for the particular gratitude of a man too tired for speeches. "You'll say I was right to write to you," Lassiter said at last, as the train came into view along the track. "That foolish feeling of mine." "I will say, mon ami," said Poirot, gathering his coat about him against the platform wind, "that a house which has buried something for 30 years does not, generally, keep it buried much longer, and that a solicitor, with a foolish feeling, is very often a solicitor who has simply noticed, before his conscious mind permitted him to name it, that the ground beneath his client's family has begun, very quietly, to give way." He paused, settling his hat with his usual precision, and looked back, once, toward the grey shape of Blackbriar still visible above the trees. It is not spirits that haunt such houses, Henry. It is never spirits. It is only the plain, stubborn refusal of the truth to stay exactly where it has been put, and sooner or later, someone always goes looking for a shovel. The train came in, and Hercule Poirot, feeling every one of his years in his lower back and rather fewer of them in his mind, climbed aboard and did not look back again.